Imagine a world where your bank account is empty, but it does not matter because your social currency is full. In this world, a brilliant brain surgeon saves a child life and receives 10 likes, while a man eating a Tide Pod on camera receives 10 million views. The surgeon loses his clinic due to low engagement. The entertainer is appointed as the new head of public health. This is not a distant dystopian nightmare. This is the logical conclusion of the world you are living in right now. A world where reality is no longer lived but measured. Every second, millions of human beings are altering their personalities, their beliefs, and their entire identities just to feed an invisible, insatiable master, the algorithm. But what happens when the metric becomes the master? What happens when the numbers meant to measure our connection end up fracturing our sanity? Welcome to the shadows of the attention economy. Segment 1. The new currency of existence and the distortion of value. For thousands of years, human status was dictated by tangible assets: land, gold, physical strength, and later, institutional knowledge. If you possessed a rare skill, society rewarded you with authority. But in the digital dawn of the 21st century, a silent coup occurred. Physical reality was overtaken by digital representation. Today, we are witnessing the birth of a new social currency, where human worth is no longer qualitative but strictly quantitative. Your intelligence, your kindness, and your existential value do not exist unless they can be rendered into a public metric. Views, likes, and shares are no longer just numbers under a post. They have mutated into the definitive ecosystem of human validation. To understand how dangerous this is, we must look at a profound behavioral phenomenon known as Goodhart's Law. Originally formulated by economist Charles Goodhart, the principle states a chilling truth. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. When a school focuses entirely on standardized test scores, it stops educating and starts training test takers. When a hospital is judged solely on waiting times, doctors are pressured to rush diagnoses rather than heal patients. In the realm of human existence, when views and likes become the target, human behavior shifts from authentic expression to strategic performance. We no longer capture a beautiful sunset to experience awe. We capture it because the sunset is an asset that can be liquidated into social points. The phenomenon is highly visible in modern digital creators and ordinary users alike. Every action is calculated through the lens of transaction. If an experience cannot be converted into engagement, it is perceived as a waste of time. This metricization of the self creates a profound cognitive distortion. It tricks the human psyche into believing that popularity equates to truth and that visibility equates to value. The long-term consequence of this shift is the systematic erasure of nuance. A complex historical analysis cannot compete with a 10-second controversial dance. Therefore, the metric economy naturally selects for the shallowest aspects of human nature. We are transforming from a society of thinkers into a society of attention merchants, desperately shouting in a crowded digital marketplace, trading our genuine identities for pieces of digital silver that can vanish with a single tweak of a background code. Segment 2. The architecture of the digital herd and dopamine exploitation. Human beings are evolutionary pack animals. Our survival once depended on staying integrated within a tribe. To be cast out was a death sentence. This evolutionary programming is precisely what social media platforms have hijacked. They have built an industrial-scale dopamine engine that preys upon our ancient need for social belonging, fueling a phenomenon we can define through gray psychology, the study of the hidden, manipulative undertones of human behavior. Inside the human brain, there is a neurochemical messenger called dopamine. For a long time, scientists believed dopamine was the molecule of pleasure. We now know it is the molecule of anticipation. Dopamine does not reward you when you achieve a goal. It fires when you are hunting for it. Social media platforms are engineered exactly like slot machines in Las Vegas. They utilize what behavioral psychologist B.F. Skinner called a variable ratio schedule of reinforcement. In his famous mid-century experiments, Skinner placed pigeons inside a box with a lever. If the lever released food every single time, the pigeons pressed it only when they were hungry. But if the food was released randomly, sometimes on the first press, sometimes on the 10th, the pigeons became obsessed. They pressed the lever continuously until they dropped from exhaustion. Every time you pull down on your social media feed to refresh it, you are a pigeon in Skinner's box. You do not know if the next post will give you a wave of validation or nothing at all. This uncertainty triggers a massive dopamine spike. When you receive a high volume of likes and follows, your brain interprets this as a rise in social status within the tribe. It releases oxytocin and dopamine, creating a brief state of artificial euphoria. But the tragedy of the dopamine loop is that it exhibits a steep tolerance curve. What stimulated you yesterday will not satisfy you today. A creator who once celebrated reaching 10,000 views will soon feel an existential dread when a video only receives 9,000. The herd follows the same rhythm. Through the psychological force of informational social influence, individuals look to the behavior of the crowd to determine correct behavior. If the crowd is liking a specific type of content, individuals alter their own preferences to match the collective aesthetic, even if it contradicts their personal morality. The long-term consequence is an acute crisis of identity. When you constantly calibrate your expressions to match the feedback of millions of strangers, your true self is slowly hollowed out. You become a hollow shell, an avatar engineered by an algorithm, living in constant terror of the day the digital herd decides to look away. Segment 3. The death of nuance and the rise of outrage engineering. As the global population migrated into this hyper-quantified reality, a second mutation occurred. The landscape of human thought began to change. When algorithms dictate what content survives, the structure of language, information, and education must adapt to the evolutionary pressures of the platform. This has led to the death of nuance. In a world where the primary goal is maximizing watch time and retention rate, complexity is a fatal defect. To understand why deep knowledge is actively punished by modern platforms, we must analyze the neurological concept of cognitive load theory, developed by educational psychologist John Sweller. Human brains are structurally designed to conserve energy. Processing nuanced, multi-layered arguments requires significant mental exertion from our prefrontal cortex. When a viewer encounters a video explaining the complex, multi-causal origins of an economic crisis, their cognitive load spikes. If the brain feels overwhelmed, it seeks an immediate escape route. On a video platform, that escape route is a single thumb swipe away to a simpler, more stimulating video. The algorithms notice this behavioral pattern instantly. To keep eyes glued to screens, the code systematically downranks content that requires high cognitive load and upranks content that triggers primal, low-effort emotional reactions. The most potent emotional trigger in the human evolutionary toolkit is moral outrage. A famous case study proving this dynamic was uncovered during internal investigations at major tech firms in the late 2010s. Engineers discovered that adding a single moral emotional word to a headline, such as hate, blame, destroy, or corrupt, increased its click-through rate by a predictable percentage. The algorithm did not learn what hate was. It simply learned that hate kept human eyes locked onto a screen for 4 minutes longer than nuance did. This creates a terrifying historical trajectory. We have built an infrastructure that actively rewards polarization. A scientist spent 30 years researching a subtle environmental shift, explaining the data with careful, conditional terminology. This scientist receives a few hundred views. Meanwhile, an untrained commentator makes a highly confident, completely inaccurate statement about the exact same topic, framing it as a vast conspiracy. This commentator receives millions of views, thousands of comments, and a flood of new followers. The long-term consequence is the complete fragmentation of shared truth. When metrics dictate authority, whoever constructs the most polarizing, easily digestible narrative wins the public consciousness. We are losing our collective ability to sit with complex problems, transforming our global discourse into a stadium of shouting factions, each hypnotized by their own custom-tailored stream of superficial certainties. Segment 4, the panopticon of self-censorship and psychological erosion. The pressure of the metric economy does not just change what we consume, it changes who we are allowed to be. When every thought, photo, and opinion you share is immediately stamped with a public score, the digital world transforms into a psychological prison. This phenomenon perfectly mirrors a famous historical architecture concept known as the panopticon, designed by philosopher Jeremy Bentham, and later analyzed by social theorist Michel Foucault. The panopticon is a circular prison design with a central observation tower. The prisoners, housed in cells around the perimeter, can never see inside the tower. They never know exactly when the guard is watching them, so they must assume they are being watched at every single moment. As a result, the prisoners systematically regulate their own behavior, internalizing the gaze of the guard. Today, social media has decentralized the tower. The guard is no longer a single person. The guard is the collective audience of the internet, armed with the power to approve or cancel you with a single metric strike. Every user is a prisoner in their own digital cell, constantly looking at their metrics to see if they have crossed an invisible line. This creates an intense state of self-censorship. Creators and regular citizens begin to filter their authentic thoughts through a mental predictive model of the algorithm. Before speaking, they ask themselves, will this optimize my metrics, or will it trigger a drop in my follower count? A devastating real-world demonstration of this psychological erosion can be found in the rise of corporate influencer culture. Over the last decade, creators who achieved massive multi-million follower milestones began to experience unprecedented rates of severe burnout, clinical anxiety, and identity fragmentation. When psychologists interviewed these individuals, they discovered a recurring cognitive crisis. The creators felt completely trapped by their digital personas. If a creator became famous for being energetic and happy, they felt they could never publicly show sadness, vulnerability, or a change in political opinion, because doing so would instantly damage their viewer retention statistics. They had built a digital brand that required them to perform a flat, unchanging version of themselves for eternity. The long-term system-wide consequence of this panopticon is the total stagnation of human creativity and personal growth. When we are too terrified of metric failure to experiment, we stop evolving. We repeat the same safe formats, copy the same viral trends, and speak in the same approved tones. We become a species of polished clones, terrified of our own authentic shadows, locked in a desperate dance for the amusement of a machine that does not even know we are alive. Segment 5. The collapse of real-world infrastructure and the illusion of competence. The ultimate destination of a metric-driven world is a systemic crisis of competence. When the map becomes more valuable than the territory, the real-world infrastructure that keeps civilization running begins to decay beneath the digital surface. We have created a paradoxical system where the appearance of skill is highly rewarded, while the actual, painful execution of skill is actively discouraged because it is non-optimized for visual consumption. This dangerous illusion can be broken down using a cognitive bias known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, combined with modern structural incentives. In a traditional setting, a practitioner acquires competence through years of invisible repetitive failure. There are no cameras in the research lab at 3 a.m. There are no lights on the structural engineer checking the tension bolts of a suspension bridge. True competence is boring, quiet, and deeply unphotogenic. However, when social metrics hijack the social hierarchy, the incentive structure flips. An individual who spends 90% of their energy practicing a craft and 10% on self-promotion will easily be drowned out by someone who spends 10% on the craft and 90% mastering the mechanics of the platform. The algorithm naturally selects for the hyper-communicator over the hyper-competent. A historic example of this systemic vulnerability can be observed in the shifting landscape of global journalism and corporate leadership over the past decade. Investigative newsrooms that once spent months verifying a single high-stakes story were forced to pivot to clickbait aggregators to survive. If a publication did not hit its daily view quotas, its ad revenue cratered and its journalists were laid off. The consequence? Society traded deep, accountability-holding journalism for a continuous stream of shallow, high-velocity commentary. In the corporate world, leaders are increasingly chosen not for their long-term operational wisdom, but for their ability to command attention and project charisma on public platforms. The long-term consequence is an invisible, creeping fragility across society. Bridges are designed by institutions mimicking viral trends. Public health policies are calibrated to placate online mobs rather than follow rigorous data. And an entire generation is growing up believing that knowing how to talk about a subject for a 60-second video is the exact same thing as mastering it. We are building a hollow civilization with a flawless digital facade, standing on a foundation of decaying expertise that will eventually give way under the weight of real-world crises. The metric prison only holds power over you as long as you agree to use its currency. The moment you realize that an algorithm cannot measure human depth, the bars begin to melt away. If you are a creator, a thinker, or simply someone trying to survive this digital landscape, your survival strategy is simple. Decouple your identity from your metrics. Build an undecentralized sanctuary for your mind. Write thoughts that are too complex for a tweet. Create things that you never post online. Measure your day not by the validation you received from strangers, but by the depth of your focus and the reality of your offline connections. Hack the system by giving it the attention it craves, but never give it your soul. If this perspective challenged the way you view your daily screen time, let me know in the comments below. Do you believe it is still possible to achieve real deep genius in a world obsessed with views? Leave a comment with the single word "unshackled" along with your thoughts, so I know who made it to the end of the matrix.